Hello and welcome to Episode 6 of Christ Revealed. Well, we're making our way down the track, aren't we? This is a 9-part docuseries, and certainly we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's a lot more ground to cover. You're going to be surprised by some of the things you're going to learn in these coming episodes. I know I was. Very life-changing, very inspiring. I also want to encourage you to own Christ Revealed, the entire series and the bonuses. It's very affordable. There's multiple packages. Find the right one for you. Make that investment, take it home, and my real hope is not only that you'll get to revisit all this and the bonus materials, but that you'll share it with family and friends and other people who I think need to hear this message right now. So thanks for taking this journey with me. Let's jump into Episode 6. Next up, we have a modern-day Indiana Jones, Dr. Randall Price. Randall Price is an amazing scholar. He's an archaeologist. He's known for a lot of things. He was the director of excavations at Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. He has spent his entire career finding biblical artifacts, and he stores them all in a museum where we actually interview him. So it's exciting to do the interview in an environment where we were surrounded with all these artifacts that he had found. You know, going back and looking at the history and the evidence through these artifacts is something that leads to inspiration. Randall Price is a bigger-than-life character. You're going to really enjoy the conversation that we had and also have a good look at some of these artifacts. So tune in. This is something that's going to be a really unique experience for you. Dr. Price, thanks so much for taking time for us today.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So give us a bio sketch on you.
Well, I teach here at Liberty University, and I'm a research professor. I also am curator of our Limited Biblical Museum, which is the setting we're in today. My background is both in teaching biblical studies, Jewish studies, and as an archaeologist. For 10 years, I was director of excavations on the Qumran Plateau, which is the site of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And now I'm involved in what's called Operation Scroll. We're looking through the caves in that area for more Dead Sea Scrolls that were hidden in jars and will help reveal more information about the Bible.
That's got to be exciting to be on the hunt for those things, I'd guess.
Well, it's exciting because it's a kind of unparalleled opportunity. Last 60 years, the politics in the region have prevented people getting to those caves. And I think generally people thought there was really nothing left to find because all of the excitement was in the 40s and 50s. And, you know, like talking about faith in general, many people think there's just nothing to find. It's all been done. And this is a world yet to explore, particularly in the Dead Sea and in other places as well.
Yeah, well, you talk about things to find. I mean, we're in the museum here, and we're surrounded by artifacts, and I have now come to find out this is your personal collection. Is there a sense of how many artifacts are here?
Well, there's about 2,800 artifacts here, collected over a period of 40 years, with the primary purpose of bringing the world of the Bible to the United States so people can see that and see for themselves that the the faith that they have is based in history, based in a context of a real place.
Now, was your faith in place before you became an archaeologist and started going out there and collecting these artifacts?
It was. In fact, that's sort of what stimulated me to do this. I and my family moved to Israel. I studied at the Hebrew University. Part of that was studying archaeology. And I just became aware of how, in a sense, shallow my own faith was. I had a sort of a storybook faith. It was traditional. It had been taught to me all of my life. And I never had challenged myself to really think, are these things true? And you just assume them. And now I'm in the living context of history where all these things actually took place. And I'm beginning to see, if you could take the actual evidence and put it together with the documents that you already knew, how much more that would strengthen your faith.
Well, that's a very interesting characterization, storybook faith. And that is really kind of the chasm that you cross, because now, when you're holding artifacts from the period, and so for people who don't have that experience personally, which is the majority of people, obviously maybe they understand the Old Testament, the New Testament, they've learned from the book, if you will. But when you're actually got your hands in the dirt and you're pulling the stuff away and it starts to corroborate what's in the book, what's the experience of that like, or what does it do to you personally?
I think that, we're more than just one sense. We have many senses. And we read, in fact, the New Testament, 1 John 1 tells us things which we have heard with our ears and seen with our eyes, things which our hands have handled concerning the word of truth.
Right.
For me, putting my hands in the dirt and pulling out an artifact that hadn't been touched in 2,000 years that could relate to a certain event that I read about in the Bible is extremely moving, because now my already emotional, spiritual senses are combined with the real objective facts that are in the ground.
Right.
And I had to put that together, and the sense is that, this really happened. If it really happened, and it really happened to people here, and I'm like those people, then the faith they had is the kind of faith I should have. Not just, I'm living in a world, particularly when I'm down at the Dead Sea, lowest spot on Earth, 2 inches of rainfall a year, up to 130 degrees temperature, nothing there, just barren. And people survived there, and they trusted God there. That's where Jesus was tested, Moses was tested, David was tested. You read about all these people living there. And for me, it made me say, when everything is stripped away, can I really survive just by faith alone? Can I really, and I think that's been translated to other parts of my life when I've lost things that I really depended on. And there was nothing left except a basic trust that God cared for me and He had spoken promises to me. Is that enough? And I think that real world experience helped me where I was, to make the leap, as it were, to my own experience.
So it's not only just validating intellectually, but on the spiritual level and the emotional level, it sort of creates a foundation or a confidence there that's maybe beyond what you would have had otherwise.
Oh yeah, well, confidence in one sense that my faith is not placed in objects that come from the ground or in archaeology or in science or anything. My faith is placed in the living God who has spoken, and I have trusted His word, and I've seen in my own experience that trust is valid. On the other hand, those types of evidences, which the Bible itself said I could expect to find. I mean, it was written in a context where this was normal. The people who lived in the Middle East, this is where the story unfolded. They saw these things. If I go there and I see those things, then all of a sudden I enter into that element of the experience. And so in a sense, there's a bit of confirmation. It simply reinforces, let's put it that way, that what I have believed is on a solid foundation. Yeah. So my faith is founded on facts.
Right.
I already had the faith, but now I have the facts that support it. And so in one sense, it holds it up a little firmer.
Yeah, so and this is where it starts to get, I think, interesting, because you've spent a lifetime, collecting this evidence, right? So there's certainly a history that's written in the Bible. There's a lot of scholarly work around the corroboration relative to that, and then there's the archaeological work, that also starts to validate, and a lot of this has come in, relatively speaking, recent times. And you start to see that there's the level of corroboration is pretty high. So when this evidence starts to stack up, from your scientific standpoint, and I also know that you have a PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas in Austin. So what conclusions have you drawn as far as relative to evidence and proof and how it ties into all of this?
Well, I think everyone comes with their presuppositions. While I believe in an objective faith, that is faith in an object outside of myself, I bring myself to that object. And it's sum total of my years being in a home with parents or not with parents, being subjected to good people, bad people, seeing maybe religious people who have gone astray or gone wrong or treated me wrong. I mean, all these things I bring to it. And so there is a reluctance many times to accept evidence, which is clearly there. The evidence is there. We interpret it differently based on those presuppositions.
Right.
I mean, everyone lives by faith. You get up in the morning because the sun has risen and you expect it to rise. You never question that.
Right.
You get in your car and you turn on the engine expecting it to start as it always does.
Right.
You have no idea about the mechanics of the engine or anything else. You just take that by faith. You may be driving to the doctor because you need an appointment, and he's going to look at you and write out a prescription for you. And basically, you can't even read that. You don't even ask him his credentials that are hanging on the wall. How many people have you successfully treated? You just take it all by faith and you do it. Then you go to a pharmacist and you take that piece of paper and you hand it to him because you can't even read it, and you expect him not to poison you to death, but to give you something that actually will help you.
Right.
We do that in our normal life all the time. That's simply faith.
Yep.
Because we're predisposed to accept these things
Right.
as normal in our culture because it's part of what we've always accepted.
Right.
I think when we come to questions of faith, who is Jesus? What is his claim? What does he ask of us? How does someone have a personal relationship with him, which is what he does ask of us? And, what's the evidence for that? We're going to bring those presuppositions. But many times, our presuppositions are forced to change by that evidence. In other words, people may have a huge presupposition against the supernatural. Okay, I don't believe it, can't happen. But then they meet people who are walking miracles,
Right.
in which things have happened, and that challenges those presuppositions. So they begin to move a little closer toward, I would think, more of an objective understanding of the evidence itself.
So, and it's very interesting, as you said, that people can have sort of these inflection points in their life where something moves them toward shifting one view of reality that they had, and now they move into a new one. With the work that you've done, well, let me ask this first. Why did you choose archaeology? I mean, why did that become the passion for you?
Well, I think for the very thing we're talking about, that in my case, I came as someone who already was trained in the Bible and history. And then I came into the living context, and I began to say, if other people could see this, what I've seen, because it emotionally changed me. A lot of my presuppositions, I had, back in my day, it was the flannel graph, and this was people may not understand what that's about, but it's putting little cutout figures on a board to tell a Bible story. Right. And Jesus was dressed in pressed linen, and he walked on carpet grass, and I thought that's the way it was. And Then I went to live in Jerusalem,
Right.
and it wasn't anything like that, And the culture and the style, everything was so different from what I was used to in my American Western culture. And I realized now, as I come to the Bible, that's what I see. That's where they lived, and so to try to read the Bible through Western eyes, with a 20th or now 21st century perspective, is to miss it. I needed to go back into the world of the Bible to understand the message when it was given, how it was given, and the language it was given, and then understanding the truth there, export it to the 21st century so I could live it out. So that's why archaeology became important to me, because it puts those details and pieces together to help us explain the text more accurately.
So, and so now what you're doing, since everybody can't go to Jerusalem, you're bringing artifacts back here so they can come visit, right here
Exactly.
in the Western world. Have you witnessed any changes in people that were profound because they've come into contact with these artifacts, or with this direct contact with history?
Yeah, many times, which is why for the last 40 years I've done tours to the Bible lands, taking people to encounter this personally. And I see how it changes them. It's different for different people, but it's moving from what their comfort zones, their understanding of things, to seeing the way things really were. And then examining their own faith to say, is it a real faith? Is it the way it really should be? Do I have, as I mentioned earlier, a storybook faith, or do I have a real faith? Okay. And so that's what this experience can do. Not the same for everyone. Some people can just hold an artifact in their hand, and all of a sudden the connection's made with 2,000-3,000 years of history to say, this came from the land of the Bible, from a place, where biblical events happened, and that's enough for me. Right. Now, many people need much more, but that experience in itself is life-changing sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I might be asking that question somewhat selfishly because we're about to go to Israel. We're taking the whole film crew out there, and it's going to be my first trip there, so I'm really looking forward to it. In your experience, direct experience, what is the most profound or most important things that you feel like you've uncovered or discovered while you're in the Mideast?
Well, every archaeologist hates to hear that question because for them it's always the next thing they haven't found.
Right.
And we don't think of ourselves as Indiana Jones, on a quest to loot and find, and but as a scientist, and that's what an archaeologist is, for me it's uncovering the past in such a way as to explain to the present what happened and why that's important, significance of things. Now, as I said, for 10 years, I was director of excavations at Qumran, which is a settlement from 2,000 years ago. It existed during the time of Jesus, during the formation of the early church, a very pivotal point in history. And it was a settlement and a group of Jewish people who were unknown in history until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they write about very interesting things. They give us a commentary on certain verses of the Bible. One is about a messianic banquet. In Isaiah chapter 25, verses 6 through 9, it talks about the final day when Messiah comes and he defeats the enemies of Israel, and the kind of a victory celebration is held, and it describes all of this in very interesting terms. When you come to the Dead Sea Scrolls, someone wrote a commentary on it. They actually wrote, but it wasn't just a commentary, it was instructions on how this should be observed. They assumed they were living at the end of days. The Roman Empire was there. They needed release from their enemies. So they expected this to happen in their day. The Messiah was coming. And so they write this about how when Messiah comes, he's going to sit down, and the men of renown will come together, and they will have this celebration, bread and wine and other things, and it's all explained. Well, in the 10 years of excavation at Qumran, we began to dig up the remains of a communal meal, which we believe relates to that very thing. We found a wine jar, sealed, never opened in over 2,000 years. We found these animal bone deposits, but they were a meal. They were cooked, and then they took the remains of the meal with all the vessels they cooked the meal in, all the vessels they served the meal in, and they went and buried them. And I'm thinking, what kind of people, in a place so desolate where pottery and things is not cheap, would take all of this and go bury it somewhere? Well, only people who had a very strong ritual concern. They believed that this was a sacred meal. It was for a very important purpose, that if you use those dishes again for a common meal or a common purpose, it would ruin it. So they could never use them again, so they took them and buried them. And by the way, it's the only place in Israel or in the world that we know of that this thing actually happened. But now I can connect a biblical passage, people who believe that passage actually expected to be part of that, and then the remains of their observation of those meals. And I'm the only person that really has that evidence still today. So for me, it's a very fascinating thing to combine biblical text, history, and personal experience, because I was involved in unearthing all of this.
Yeah, that's it. So, and what was the time frame to unearth this whole thing?
Well, 10 years,
Yeah,
basically.
wow.
That was, we did to excavate the entire plateau where these things were hidden.
Wow. So, yeah, that's a 10-year passion project.
Yes, for sure.
I guess it's a game of centimeters, right? As you're getting in there over time, to uncover all this stuff. So, well, let's talk about the team that's with you, okay? So what are, kind of, in a general sense, what are their backgrounds and orientations, and what's the spirit of this excavation like?
Well, every archaeological team has people with certain expertise, people who can, shall we say, be an area supervisor and control how a dig should happen, people who are involved in administration to make sure everything works well, and then people who can document those finds, and photographers and all of that. And then we have simply volunteers. And this is where it gets exciting. I bring students. People come from all walks of life, join with me in this, and they make discoveries for the first time in their life. I'll tell you a story. There was a man in his late 60s. He came. We started like 4 in the morning, and it was already getting hot by 5 or 6 o'clock. He hadn't had breakfast. He was using a pickaxe trying to dig, and he just said, "Look, I'm giving up. I can't do this anymore." He said, "I'm too old. I'm going to change my flight ticket and leave today." And I sat down on the edge of the bulk. This is the excavation square. And I just prayed. I said, Lord, I want to encourage this man, to do. He came all this way and did this. Can you do something? And it was amazing. The very next time he stuck his shovel in the ground, he pulled up this beautifully preserved oil lamp.
Wow.
And he said, "What's this?" And I said, "You found the find, of this year for sure."
Wow.
Perfectly preserved. And there's only been one other like this that was found in a partial form in one of the caves of Qumran. So it's a very important thing. So he got his picture holding it. It ended up on a cover of a magazine.
Wow.
He stayed 2 more weeks. So just the passion and the experience of actually making a find just changed him from disappointment to, confidence.
Wow. And with these volunteers, is that what they do? They come and cycle in and out like every couple of weeks or a couple of months?
They come for the time that they can come,
Yeah.
and we train them, and they do a certain job. And then some make repeat trips over and over through the years. And I've actually seen people, as a result of doing this, go now back to school, become an archaeologist, get the passion. So some people, we say, get bit by the archaeological bug, and others don't. But you can see them as they're working. They just you can't even get them to stop for the day. They're so excited.
That's great. What's interesting, another thing that's probably I think important to talk about, is the context of being there, because it is culturally extremely different, right? The environment's very different, the seasons, the temperature, everything seems to be different there. And so if you're trying to understand the Bible, through reading it, and living where you live, let's say in the Western world, and then when you go and you exist there, there's a different contextual experience you have that can deepen the understanding. So talk a little bit more about that.
Well, let me say first, we have sometimes the feeling that the Bible's a grab bag. It's whatever I want it to mean. It can mean anything I want. And so it doesn't really matter who it was written to or when it was written or where it was written. I'm applying it to my experience. Well, there's a devotional sense of application which is correct with that. But we can't get there until we understand that God chose a place, and He chose a time. In the Bible, it tells us, in the fullness of time, or at the right time, God sent His Son to be born of a woman and be born under the law, when that was in effect. It says He came to His own people. And so He was born as a Jew, because God had chosen Abraham and his descendants, the Jewish people, to be the bearers of His revelation and to extend that to the world. So if you were going to to get that message, you're going to have to go to them. And then, so he came as part of a whole line of promises made to them that they could expect one who would come. One who would be the seed of Abraham, one would be the line of David, one who would be, ultimately born in Bethlehem. All these promises were made, and he came to fulfill those. And so when we go to approach the Bible, we have to approach it on its own terms, not our terms. So I have to go back to that place. I have to go to that context, either by getting books to help me understand that, watching films like yours to help understand that, or to actually go there myself. And then we're in the place where we can put it all together and say, okay, now I can see things through the eyes of those who wrote the Bible, who lived the Bible. And once I understand it as they understood it, then I can take the next step. How should I understand it for myself?
Yeah. With all your experience in talking about evidence as it keeps mounting up over time, you've got a handbook on biblical archaeology. Can you tell us about that and what's it describe?
Well, in this particular case, I'm walking through the Bible, picking out verses that need explanation from the archaeological world. Again, trying to put the text back into a context so we can understand it better. And that's where we have not only places, but we also have artifacts that illustrate those places. I mean, some are very key because they will mention the names of people in the Bible, or they relate to the historical figures in the Bible. For instance, when we talk about Jesus, the historical Jesus, he had a Roman trial, and so you have the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. We have inscriptions of Pontius Pilate that he left for us. We have the Jewish trial of Jesus, Joseph Caiaphas, and we have the ossuary or bone box of Caiaphas with his name on it. These are people related to Jesus personally.
Let's dig into that for a second. So in the bone box, and this is where maybe the debate comes in. From your point of view, you feel that it's very validating, the discovery of this bone box, but others might say, well, they're not convinced yet. So talk about both sides of that so we can see how these things are discussed.
I talk more in terms of plausibility than proof, because you'll never be able to prove things absolutely. I mean, there's some cases where there's just no doubt. We have the name of the place, you're digging there, it says it, what else could it be? With the Caiaphas issue, here we have a family tomb. We have obviously a wealthy family. There were 12 ossuaries or bone boxes where they put the bones of the people a year after their death in these boxes to make room for barrels in the regular niches. And one of those boxes is very ornate. It's carved with palmettes and rosettas and all kind of things that were very typical of someone of rank. In the box, there is the bones from carbon dating. We know someone about 60 years of age. And we know that written on the box, inscribed on it, is the name Joseph Caiaphas. There's two inscriptions of that, spelled somewhat differently. And so we know from the New Testament there was a man named Caiaphas who was the high priest at the time of Jesus. We know that from Josephus Flavius, a first century Jewish historian, there was he writes about a man named Joseph Caiaphas, and so this ossuary has both of those. So even though there's not a title that says high priest, and even though we don't have clear, direct evidence, there's nothing that, how could you in a case like this? But from the ancient world that we know, we have a lot of names, we have a lot of descriptions. There is no other Caiaphas that we can match to this. It's the only one we know. He was a wealthy man. He was a man of rank. He was an older man. All of this fits the picture. So what evidence am I willing, to take to validate something in my mind? Well, I already come with the presupposition that we have an historical character named Caiaphas, and that he was there presiding over the Jewish trial of Jesus. He actually organized the plot against Jesus, we read. And by the way, ossuaries, these bone boxes, have a very narrow lifespan. I mean, they started maybe about 100 years before the time of Jesus and end just shortly after that. So very, very short period of time. So we have something from the right time. We have someone with the right name. We have someone with the right, conditions in terms of the nature of this tomb. Why would I not then at least be plausible that this is the Joseph Caiaphas that was mentioned in the New Testament?
Yeah.
Again, your presuppositions are brought to that,
Right.
but I'm more predisposed to accept it than to reject it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a high level of likelihood here, right? So as compared to saying there's a remote possibility, I mean, this seems very plausible.
But again, why would someone not accept that evidence? Well, that would lead them to the historical Jesus and ultimately to the claims of that historical Jesus upon their own life, which might be very uncomfortable, not willing to want to go there or concede that or to be examined, in terms of their own faith. Right. And so they would want as much as possible to try to make that evidence less than it could be in their case.
So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because they'd say, they're looking for reasons to deny it or to say that to invalidate. And I think if somebody were to come at it objectively, you could say, could you say this is 100% certain? No. Is it a very high degree of likelihood? I mean, there's so many pieces that would have to add up. The probability of it not being him, is very low, seemingly.
And I don't think people consciously come out to refute something. I mean, there are some where their career is built on a certain premise that they have to attack a contrary premise in order to retain, their standing, everything that they know and everything that they are.
Right.
And it is true. I mean, when we talk about Jesus, particularly Jesus, I mean, you can talk about Buddha, Confucius, anybody you want to in history, and it does not seem to have the same effect on people as Jesus does.
Right.
Because he's the only one that said, if you believe in me, you have eternal life. If you trust me, you take my word. No one else made those kind of claims. No one else claimed to rise from the dead. No one else claims, to be able to take you to heaven simply for believing in him and what he did on your behalf. And so there's, I think, in a certain level, I may not perceive for most people, there's a threat. And it's a challenge. So they are going to be more diligent about trying to unravel this than try to simply accept it. Right. And you'll see this. You'll see people who have faith. Most people come to me and say, well, I don't need that. I don't need to find that. I don't need to find anything. I'm fine. I just believe what I was told. And other people say, well, that's gullible, and you are someone who really can't be serious. But they are, because their faith does not require that amount of evidence in order to be confirmed.
Well, what's interesting is you had faith before you started in your career, but still got excited about and have eminently succeeded in a career that keeps building evidence. And it's not like you had maybe the need of it, but I guess somehow it still was stimulating to you.
Well, I mean, faith grows. There was a time when I didn't have faith. I didn't believe. I started down a more scientific path. I was, there were a lot of things I could not explain that I didn't know if I wanted to call them supernatural, but they were intriguing. But the Bible wasn't part of that. And when it became part of that, as I had someone challenge me to consider its claims and to believe, it took a while, but eventually I found that the Bible was trustworthy. And if the Bible is trustworthy, its message was trustworthy, and therefore I could trust the one who gave that word, which was Jesus himself. That moved me into a whole different level in which there was a relationship. There are people, I remember the whole story about Albert Einstein's wife. They said, do you understand, Albert's theory of, relativity and all that? She said, no, I don't. She said, but I know Albert. He can be trusted. I say, I don't know everything that there could be. I'll never have enough knowledge in all these various fields to be able to have, to say, I know absolutely for sure. But I've come to know the one who I believe is life and who has spoken, and I think his word is true, and I've found that he can be trusted. So I come with that trusting factor when I come to his word. Now, there's a lot to understand, and I'm seeking to understand it,
Right.
and I try to. That's how my faith grows. As it starts very small, and experiences, especially in trusting God and seeing him come through for me, testing me, and knowing that it actually is a test, and if I react correctly, I kind of grow even more.
Yeah.
And then all the evidences and things that I have. Evidence not just from archaeology, but from the general sciences and from other parts of life, give me, I guess, a firmer foundation than what I had. The foundation was enough to support me.
Right.
It's secure.
Right.
But it just gets more solid, and I feel that sense that, these things are true.
Yeah.
There was a philosopher named Francis Schaeffer. He talked about true truth. So in that sense, it's true, but it's true for me.
Right.
And it's objectively true, but it's also subjectively true
Yes.
in this case.
Yeah, so it's a faulty premise to think that science and faith are mutually exclusive things.
Well, let's take. Science is very much a changing discipline. You go back even 5 years in some science, and it's old hat. We know things are very different now.
Right.
The way people operated in the medieval period is barbaric, and the people, maybe 20 years from now will think things we do are barbaric.
Right.
And so our understanding of astronomy, we just don't know.
Right.
Recently we had an eclipse of the sun here. And you think, well, the sun is so big and the moon is so small, how in the world does it cover the whole sun? Well, the sun is 400 times larger than the earth, but the earth is 400 times closer, the moon is 400 times closer to the earth than the sun is.
Right.
And that proportion works just right, to make a solar eclipse. That's not observable everywhere in the universe, but it is here.
Right.
And for me, someone designed that. That's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. It wouldn't work if it wasn't just right.
Right.
And so these kind of evidences that come all the time in the world we live in, from the sciences, continue to impress me that my faith is genuine.
So an area that you also have particular expertise in is the Old Testament, or maybe the linkages from the Old Testament into the New Testament.
Right.
Can you talk about that area of your expertise?
Well, the Old Testament, or we call it the First Testament, or simply, in Jewish terms, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, 3 parts of the Bible, the law, the prophets, the writings. This is the revelation that God gave through time to the Jewish people to then disseminate to the world. In Genesis 12:3, Abraham is told, I will bless those who bless you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So people often wonder, wasn't it odd of God to choose the Jews? Why them? Well, it wasn't all about them. They were simply servants, to be used to bring the message to the rest. They're a means of blessing to the world. And so that message that was given has an end game, that is to bless, to bring God's salvation and his peace on earth, and all the things people want are wrapped up in that package. So God has a plan. He reveals that plan down through time. It starts with this First Testament, the Old Testament, all the way, for me, back to the original man and woman in a garden. As it says in Genesis 3:15, there that the seed of the woman will be in conflict with the seed of the serpent who deceived her, and ultimately, while the serpent will bruise his heel, he will crush his head. We see that expanded in the Bible, but that's a very initial promise of the fact that a woman will have a child. That child will be the one who saves them from the curse, from the evil one. Ultimately, he will himself be wounded in some way, and I think it's a fatal wound. When a snake bites you, pretty much you're on the way out.
Right.
But of course, he must recover from that in order to ultimately crush that one and have the victory. So we have already from the very beginning of the Bible a kind of a picture of what God wants to do. We see the outline, and then he starts to fill that in. Abraham is chosen, and says, now of your seed, there's going to be one. So it's a seed of a woman, now it's a seed of Abraham, who is the father of the Jewish people. So it's going to be someone Jewish. And then it tells us that there is a tribe of Judah, and that there's going to be a king that comes from the tribe of Judah. And then it says from the tribe of Judah, there's a family called the house of David. And now that seed is going to come from that line as well, and will be there forever. And then you get all these pictures of, this is one who we'll call him a branch that branches out, a righteous branch. Talks about him as a king, talks about him as a conqueror, talks about him as one who's going to ultimately bring the hope of Israel together. And then it talks about a place where he'll be born, Bethlehem, a house of bread, so that this one who, a place of feeding, place of sustenance, and all this came together, of course, as we move through history to Jesus of Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, he was born of the lineage of Abraham, born of the tribe of Judah, born of the house of David, and in fact then goes on to proclaim himself the King of the Jews. When he died, that was the words written by his enemy, the one who punished him, written on the placard above his cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And of course, the story doesn't end there. We believe it goes on with the resurrection 3 days later, and then the promise that I will come again, and all these things that he laid out in the Old Testament he would do. He would establish a kingdom, and he would rule over Israel and the nations. He would bring peace on earth. War would end. All kind of glorious things would happen, and that's what we wait for. So for me, if I connect these dots, going down this, shall we say, highway of promise, that if you take this by faith, and then you say, what happened? Take it by faith, this happened. And now we look back on these things, all of having happened in one person, one time, and, we say now, if it happened literally, and it happened as precisely as it did then, can I not then trust what he said will yet happen? And we actually have a passage of the Bible that talks about that, says, you have your faith made more sure because of the fulfillment of these messianic promises. So now I look forward to the coming of the Messiah again to fulfill the rest of what he said he would do.
So now that, and obviously you have such a great grasp on this, when you're in Israel or in Jerusalem, and you are interacting with people of other faiths, what's that dynamic like? Because I'm sure you speak to other people who are principals in their faith, and that you have these interactions as you're doing your work. What's that like?
Well, I would say there is a common core. For those who respect the Bible, we have certain basic principles, basic beliefs that we share. But again, those presuppositions come in. I happen to have a Jewish background, but for Jewish people, what you find is that now they have the experience of persecution and pogrom and the Holocaust and all of these things, much of it in the name of Jesus, much of brought about by what they call the church. The result is the last thing they want to hear or deal with is Jesus. To them, many Orthodox Jews, it's still a swear word. I'll never say Jesus, I say Yeshu, which just means may his name be accursed. And his proper name is Yeshua, and built off the verb Yeshua, which means to save. And so in the New Testament it says, you shall call his name Jesus, for you'll save his people from their sins. But again, all that is, shall we say, obscured by the emotional, historical experience of persecution and suffering under the cross, under the name of Jesus, all these things that have happened. So there's a point at which we share certain things, but there's a point at which you just can't go. And only, as someone has looked at the evidence themselves and begin to honestly look at it, despite all this emotional historical baggage, can they move beyond that? And of course, there are thousands of people have.
Right.
In Israel, there are congregations of Jewish people, Israelis, who believe in Jesus, even though it's counterculture, and they're considered renegades and even, blamed for the genocide of their own people, because the typical Jewish view is if you believe in Jesus, you're no longer Jewish.
Right.
As though somehow, magic transformation happened and you change somehow. You can be an atheist and be a Jew, but you can't be a Christian and be a Jew. So, and it's again tied to this this whole history that's there. But those people who step back objectively and are able to look at it have been able to embrace a Jesus who their own culture and people reject. And so with them, of course, I share a different affinity because we both had our own journeys to Jesus and understand what that's about.
Some of the more stimulating artifacts that you might have relate to coins. You have silver coins back there that would have been the same types of coins that Judas would have received.
Yeah, I mean, I have basically every coin of biblical significance. I have a coin that has probably the Star of Bethlehem on it. I have coins of Augustus Caesar, who was the emperor when Jesus was born. I have coins that Jesus would have used. He referred to the pruta of Alexander Jannaeus, which they call the widow's mite, the small coins. I have the denarius. All these things are mentioned in the Bible, particularly ones that are related to Jesus' ministry and life. The coin used for paying taxes, the several shekel, the Tyrian shekel, the half shekel, which was the one was paid Judas Iscariot as the money paid to someone who, for the value of a slave, is what it was.
Right.
And so that's a silver coin. Even have coins related to many things related to Jewish history. One of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who proclaimed himself divine. It's written on the coin like that. Antiochus Epiphanes, God manifest. And this is behind the one who defiled the temple. And the Jews rose up, family of the Maccabees, and defeated him, rededicated the temple. The word for rededication is Hanukkah. So this is the whole event of that. Have coins minted by Titus and Vespasian, the father and son who destroyed the second temple after the time of Jesus, and minted coins that have Judea capta on it, Jews captive, and show them. So I mean, in coins we have a whole history of these events, and that's exciting in itself because they have often a date and time. I have a coin. Many of them, in fact, minted by Pontius Pilate, and one's dated the very year of the crucifixion.
Wow!
So here's a coin by the guy who condemned Jesus to the cross,
right,
with the very date of the date it happened. So those things are stimulating.
I to say the least. And you also have nails, I think, right?
We have many of the Roman crucifixion nails from the first century. I have one of the barbs from the cat of nine tails they used to scourge a victim, such as Jesus was scourged with. Roman dice. The Bible tells us that the Roman officers gambled for his seamless garment. They didn't want to tear it apart, so they have those kind of dice. The kind of spear that pierced his side. I have that exact spear.
Wow.
Not that spear, but one like it.
Yes.
It's called the Spear of Destiny. It has a whole history,
right,
but that's not the one I have, but I have one like it. And a number of other things like that related to these events, because they still exist. People sometimes don't realize that so much from the ancient world is still there. It can be unearthed, and therefore the present can connect with the past in very exciting ways.
And again, these are all pieces of things that are written about in the Bible. But then they're they exist in material fact, and the reference, like you said, even things like you're talking about the barbs, it's like, wow, this is written about, and here they are.
Yeah, but again, think about it. It means an average person looking at it says, so what? It's just a piece of metal. And if you reduce it to that level, that is all it is. But now you bring the document, which we believe is a document given by God, which explains for us the one, God himself coming into time to take our form, to pay for our sins, to do an act, and that it was history. And then now these things are related to that.
Yeah.
It becomes something far more exciting, where some people, as a matter of faith, even would consider it a relic, and venerate it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, but I mean, their faith and emotions drive them to see that as something of that importance.
Yeah.
So again, it's what you bring to it
Yeah.
when you come.
And you have a PhD in Near East Studies from the University of Texas, a secular university, and you now teach at a Christian university. And there's, what do you feel like the trends are for university students in general, especially those who maybe were born in Christian families, but maybe have, the university experience starts to alter their view? What are you observing?
Yeah, it's very different in every generation. I mean, we had, the Generation X. Well, I'm the baby boomers, but the Generation X, and then you had the millennials, and Generation Y is with us now, and then Generation Z is coming up now. I mean, this is the first year in which we have people come into the university who are not born in the 20th century, I mean, at all. So something like 9/11 for many kids is going to be ancient history. I mean, something they never experienced or know about.
Right.
But now we also come from a world that is biblically literate. Public schools do not teach that. They even purposely try to distance themselves from that. They come with a worldview that is formed from your culture, primarily, mainly from video games and television or whatever, movies, wherever you get, peers, and it's pretty mixed up. And we here have a biblical worldview. And one of the first courses every student takes is biblical worldview, to help them understand the various worldviews that exist out there, how this one differs, and the significance it brings, to orient yourself into a relationship with the living God who made all these things. Because if you're part of that creation, you're really not right until you're rightly related to the one who made it and sustains it. And then to think you could actually know that one personally and be guided by him is an amazing thing. And so then you begin to look at all of your sciences and subjects and arts and everything through the lens of that biblical worldview. And now, being a law enforcement officer is important because God made you to serve and defend and protect, or the arts because God is a designer and these creative things. You feel energized by knowing that you have the God who made all things has given you the gifts and skills to do this. And music and all these things. And in my area, just to dig deeper into the understanding of the background of this through archaeology and sciences, here we try not to steal faith, but to instill faith.
Right.
And I think the statistics are something like more than 80% of kids who are raised even in a homeschool, Christian school, good church, lose their faith when they come to college. Because it's never been their faith. It's been the family's faith, the parents' faith, the church's faith. They've never themselves come to the place where they've had to grapple with these issues, come to a firm decision for themselves. Tradition won't do it. You got to have truth. And so they come to a college, and if you don't give them that, in fact, if you hide that, or shall we say rail against that, as many universities do, feeling like we got to keep church and state and everything separate, and worst thing on earth is to be religious. Well, in a sense, I think religious is a problem. I'd rather have a relationship than be a religious person. But
what is that distinction?
Well, a religion is my attempt to try to please God, to find out who He is, and in some way find out what He wants, and to hopefully do something that'll help me in a relationship with that one. A relationship is where God took the first step, and He came to me. He revealed Himself, and He said, I love you, and I responded to that love and to that invitation, and as a result, a relationship is formed. And I find there's really nothing I can do to please him or to gain his approval. That's all done. He did that.
Right.
And so I live in a relationship that is already secure and confident. I simply grow in that relationship.
That's
and
a great
faith.
distinction. I've
Yeah.
not heard anybody make that distinction, but I think it's a very important one.
But, as we have about 15,000 students here at Liberty, as many come with no faith at all. And the parents want them to come here because that was a safe environment, conservative environment, whatever it might be. And they're challenged concerning faith. Some may never believe, some struggle to believe, but many do believe. And we have a lot of students who come to faith in their first, second years, and then it just is a life-changing thing. Now, looking at all of life and the choices ahead of them from a biblical worldview, it's not, where can I make the most money, or, what job is, the job of the future, or, what's going to get me. It's not me anymore.
Right.
It's what does God want from my life? And God gives his best to those who leave the choice with him. Right. And they've learned to do that. And so we have many students who, whether they're in our medical school, in our law school, whatever they see themselves as servants. And they go into that profession to try to help, to serve, to better others rather than themselves. And in the process, of course, they help themselves too.
Sure.
But that's what it's about.
That's fascinating journey you just took us on. And, so with maybe just a little final word, so what do you see for the future of Christianity?
Christianity has a lot of challenges, basically from within. The problem of a cultural shift in which very few things are believable. We have people who want to believe. We have people who need to believe, but they don't know what to believe. And they have to find people who are believable. And unfortunately, we are running churches like a business rather than demonstrating real love and concern and sacrifice for others, and not as believable as it used to be. And people are looking for that. They're fleeing from the traditional churches because they're not finding that there.
Right.
And I think that we have to change our image, our brand, in one sense, to be what we were called to be. As we do that, as we conform more to Christ and who he is, and we reach out. I mean, it's not about being comfortable, making it our own. No, it really is about we're no longer our own. We've been bought with a price, and we're to glorify God with our bodies and all that we are. When you start making those kind of choices, that's contagious.
Yeah.
People see that and say, I don't know, nothing else has worked for me. I'm frustrated. I've got everything, but I don't have that. How do you get that? And so, let's put it this way: people who are genuine, who are believable, then they can lead someone to real faith.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been fascinating to have this conversation with you. I appreciate you taking the time because I know how busy you are. And I think what you shared is going to enlighten a lot of people.
Good.
I wasn't kidding when I said that Randall Price is a modern day Indiana Jones, right? I mean, he looks the part, he acts the part, he lives that life. He's an amazing character, an amazing human being, and he's brought such great and wondrous things into view so all of humanity can share in the inspiration of Christ. On the shores of the Sea of Galilee was discovered a first-century synagogue where it was certain that Jesus taught. Our interview coming up next is with Father Eamon Kelly, and you're going to notice something that I noticed. His energy is contagious. Right there on the shores of the Sea of Galilee is this temple that was discovered, a first-century synagogue that they excavated. We're going to take a look at that, but also what was discovered there was something quite amazing, which many consider to be the greatest archaeological find, if not in the last 50 years, maybe the past several centuries, and that is the Magdala stone. And rather than me get into all the details and explanations around this, why don't we just get into the interview and you can discover what I did in this particular area of our trip when we were journeying for Christ Revealed. You're going to like this. Enjoy. So tell me about this room.
Well, everybody looks at the picture.
Yes.
And they're drawn by it and they miss the floor. So, Pat, we're standing on the first century floor where Jesus would have walked. Mm-hmm. And we needed a spot to put a chapel where all of the Christians could pray. And this would be, in principle, an ecumenical chapel. Mm-hmm. We call it the Encounter Chapel because the evangelicals have a problem with the word ecumenical, which the main churches do not have.
Right.
And if you look at this, it's an unusual chapel. Have you ever seen a chapel designed like this?
No. So what
But if you're a Jewish person and you come in here on Shabbat, and we have many secular Jews coming in here, they look at this and they say, why did you Christians, build a chapel like a synagogue? Huh. You know, we just came from the synagogue, so it's just like what we just saw.
Right.
With the 2 rows of seating, a stone, the pillars,
yes,
and the colors. And we have redone the colors, tested them in a lab, analyzed them, and reproduced them. So with this construct, with this architecture, we are back in the first century.
Wow.
We're actually standing on real first century, but we have the environment of the first century synagogue. And we have to now ask, well, why do we do that? Mm-hmm. Well, our synagogue, imagine a priest saying our synagogue, mm-hmm, has 2 generations, so more or less 0 to 30.
Yeah.
And then from Pentecost until just prior to temple destruction. Mm-hmm. So let's focus, well, the first generation Jesus would have walked there, would have been in the synagogue.
Right.
I say he would have been here more often because he was with the people where they were working.
Right.
But in the second generation after Pentecost, who's using the synagogue? Jewish people.
Yes.
But among them, like you have Peter and John are going to the temple, mm-hmm, for afternoon prayer in the Acts of the Apostles. They were Jewish people. They didn't stop going to the synagogue on Shabbat.
Right.
So in this synagogue, we would have a Jewish community, and among them a number of Jesus' disciples. Mm-hmm. A small number, a large number, we don't know how many. And they would be in the synagogue with the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Jesus' disciples were not divided into Presbyterian, Methodist, Evangelical, right, Anglican, Episcopalian, Seventh-day Adventist, the whole 9 yards, nor were we alienated from the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. So our synagogue actually is like an icon of our commonality,
yeah,
what we share together. So we have a first century archaeology of commonality. Mm. And here we have a 21st century architecture of communion with each other, yes, walking together, encountering each other, meeting each other, recognizing each other.
And isn't that unique in the world? I mean, I've never seen this in any other part of the world.
It's beautiful to be at an original biblical site.
Yes.
Where we captured that first century moment, mm-hmm, and it's also translated into the 21st century when we so need today, yeah, to meet each other again and learn about each other.
Well, the common roots and common heritage seems to be something you want to promote and exhibit as compared to try to hide and show your distinctions.
Yes, I think even just think of your own children. Mm-hmm. Each one of them will want to present their individuality. Sure. And it's very important for, yeah, the young person to discover this. But your family would never work if you and Laurie don't bring out the fact that you're a family.
Yeah.
That even if these 3 kids can be at loggerheads on occasion, that we're one family.
Yeah.
And we're going on a vacation or we're doing something together, we're a family. And we need this in humanity today. Yeah. We don't need to suppress the individuality or the particular of each community, but we also need to recognize how much we share in common.
Yeah.
This picture is fascinating from an awful lot of aspects. I always ask people, how big is Jesus' big toe? It's huge. And you didn't notice this when you came in, Pat.
No.
And look at the toenails broken, the dirt under the toenails,
yes,
the realism, the depth. And this lady is an elderly lady from Chile, and she's very ill. Uh-huh. And the story of that woman who was bleeding for 12 years and, yes, touches the wings of Jesus' garment. And here Jesus presented with the prayer shawl of the Jewish people, right, in this image. Now, an interesting trivia, if you will, which is really not a trivia, about this, all of the art in Duc and Altum, is that this was done by a Chilean who was Protestant.
Right.
And upstairs, the icons were done by a Chilean who is Orthodox of Greek and Russian backgrounds. Uh-huh. And the main decoration was done by Maria Jesus Fernandez, a Catholic. And so without us intending this or looking for this, Providence brought the great streams of Christianity together to decorate Duc and Altum, at the same time confirming what we're discovering in the very stones of Magdala, that we belong together, that here we were following Jesus together, and we discovered this also within our Jewish roots.
Wow.
Part of the infrastructure of the first century port. You can see all the port that extends here behind this wall that we built.
Wow.
Exact same pavement. And if we think, with whom did Jesus work?
Right.
Were they electricians or truck drivers? What type of profession were they?
Right.
They were fishermen.
Yes.
So where do you meet fishermen?
At the port.
You don't swim out to see them in the boat, right? You
right.
wait and you drink a wine or a glass of beer, and then they're in at the port, right?
Right.
So Jesus, after walking 2 days from Nazareth, and he's going to go on to Capernaum and Bethsaida on the north of the lake. We're here at the widest point of the west of the lake. And he meets a port, a town, a fish processing town. Migdal Nun in Hebrew means fish tower.
Right.
And the Greek name Tarichea means tossing, like tossing salad, tossing flour, tossing hay in the farm. And so they were tossing the fish. And Strabo, the Greek historian, would have used the word tarichea, the Greek word for the tossing, when he tells us that fish from Magdala was sold in Rome. So they were exporting fish. That means that, Patrick, if you were in Los Angeles and you had the extreme privilege of eating fresh Irish salmon.
Right.
Not the Alaska stuff.
Right.
So can you imagine fish from Magdala 2,000 years ago being shipped from here to Caesarea Maritima and on to Rome?
Wow.
Now think of all the fishermen on the lake. They're going to be focused on the export trade. When we sold lambs and cattle at home on the farm in Ireland, we were very happy. My dad was happy when he got an extra penny in the pound if it was going to England or export to Europe, and rather than the home market. So these fishermen, I'm sure, were focused on Magdala. And we have a lot of infrastructure here probably related to the fishing industry, fish processing industry. So Jesus was with the fishermen. This was the town that he met. So we have a very unique find here as another part of this first century town. You know, Magdala is the only complete first century town discovered in Israel, excavated in the Holy Land.
And we're quite a ways from the synagogue that was unearthed, so it flows all the way down to here, what's been excavated.
Yes.
So this is like a whole town that existed here.
Right. It's a big town. Flavius Josephus spoke to about 30,000, 40,000 people. Critics say that he exaggerated. Modern archaeological estimates say Magdala had 3,000 to 4,000 people, which would still make it a nice little town at that time. And it was obviously significant that it merited to be the scene of a battle with the Romans. And so there's actually Jewish blood probably spilt on this floor also, on this pavement 2,000 years ago in September 67 when the Romans crushed the Jewish uprising here. So then Jesus gets here in 2 days walking, and he has another day left to walk, so why not get in a boat?
Right.
The fishermen say, you're a nice guy, we like the way you talk, I'd like to show you my family, come on the boat with us. And we have so many boat stories crossing to the other side in the gospel.
Yes.
So it's not difficult for us to imagine how these encounters could have happened here.
Yeah. Now,
So that's the first thing about this room here, about this chapel.
when Jesus came back from Nazareth, and he would get together with the fishermen here.
Pat, let me show you something outside this window. This window over here, you'll see the meaning of this floor. Patrick, a first century port.
Oh.
And Jesus is with fishermen, and this is on his path from Nazareth to Capernaum, Bethsaida. So many stories going in the boat to the other side. Could it happen here? All the fishermen are concentrating on Magdala for the export trade fish to Rome.
Wow.
Isn't this amazing?
Yeah, it is.
Jesus here with the fishermen. They're happy campers. They just sold fish for an extra penny in the pound. And they're whistling on the boat. They've invited him to go back with them, and he's talking kingdom in the boat.
Wow.
This is, you can get goosebumps here.
So you found 4 of these, and what are they?
Exactly. These are ritual purification baths. The word in Hebrew is mikvah for one. Mikvaot is the plural. So we have 4, 1, 2, 3, and the 4th one over there. And they are considered by the experts here to be the best built. that have been so far discovered, the best conserved,
Wow.
and also the best water supply, which comes from the arch, and the water's coming from Mount Arbel.
Ah, okay.
And the next set of mikvaot of this category, which have been so far discovered on the planet, are in Europe in the Middle Ages, in Germany and France, in Speyer and Grenoble, where they had great Jewish communities in the Middle Ages.
And these are dated for when?
They're also first century.
They're also first century. Wow.
We actually did a test this summer. We had the latest archaeological test was trying to assess if there was something prior to the first century inhabitation of this space, and it seems that there was not. There will also be some things here of second century, so it's possible that there was some further usage of the space, which you can see that were treasured. And this
Sure.
the structure is so well built,
Right.
and so it's and with the mosaic floor behind us, this was a very, very special location. There's also reports that there was a priestly family living in Magdala, which would have service at the temple. And just like Zechariah in Ein Karem, where we remember him today, the father of John the Baptist, he went to the temple to do his service. So there were priest families around the country that went to the temple for a week or whatever of service, and one of those families lived in Magdala.
Oh, wow.
And this is the understanding. So this could help explain the intense ritual consciousness of the Magdala people as evidenced in the synagogue, in the mikvaot that we find here.
Nice.
So the significance of these mikvaot is also very powerful for us. If we look at the theology of baptism in the New Testament, St. Paul is talking about us dying in Christ and coming to new life in Christ. And this is a totally Jewish practical theology of the mikveh, because you became Jewish
Right.
not by instruction,
Right.
not by circumcision. That didn't cut it. You needed to go and do the mikveh and go into the water and come out a new man with a new name, and all your past was erased.
Wow.
And we think of our terminology in the New Testament, a new man and the old man that's dead
Yes.
with Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
So we didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah.
We're here. We have a crossroads here of Jewish and Christian history.
Well, that's amazing.
Yes.
So let's go look at the synagogue.
Let's do that. Pat, look at this, all the pottery here that the rain has washed up. Look at this.
This is actual first century pottery.
First century pottery. Look at this here. I already know I am not an expert at all about these lines. This is first century pottery for sure.
Wow.
And this is just washed by the rain. So this is a town that was lived in, and people broke their pottery jars. I mean, they fell,
Right.
and they had an accident, and that wasn't nice, but their pottery shards remain here.
Wow.
It's amazing. So, hey Pat, why don't you just go down those steps? You're not afraid of scorpions and snakes, are you?
I don't prefer them, but what's down here? Oh, wow. So what am I seeing down here? It seems like it's kind of like a cavern that bends around a corner.
Yeah, there are more steps there still
Yes.
that are filled up meanwhile with some runoff sediments from the rain, the winter rains. Basically, we have a shaft for the extraction of water to replenish the pools that you're going to see when you come outside here, Pat.
Oh, wow.
So you survived that one, Pat.
Yes.
So bring out your bucket of water with you and pour it in here in the...
And that's how they did it.
Probably.
Yeah.
And so the standing theory here is that this was for fish processing industry, totally related to Magdala. From here, this is one unit.
Right.
Look at how well built this is compared to the
Yes.
other surface. So there was a lot of traffic here. So the idea is that here we have 6 units from here down to the plastic,
Uh-huh.
and we have other units on the site. So one standing explanation is this is for the fish processing industry, where they were tossing the fish, salting the fish for export.
Oh, wow.
There are some other archaeologists who dispute this now, so we're going to have some fun for a while until the dust settles on the arguments.
Yeah, that's great. So we're surrounded by the synagogue here, and looks like approximately the center. So is this the place where the stone was found?
Exactly where you see it, and,
Yeah.
and this is a replica. And here we have the menorah
Mm-hmm.
and the golden altar underneath it, even though it wouldn't be placed like that in the temple. The entrance to the temple with the columns and the arch.
All right.
And this is the crown jewel of all the discovery.
Yeah.
And the crown is the synagogue of
Right.
this first century town.
Right.
And it's that because of the mosaics we see here, the rosette mosaic and the unending pattern mosaic. And then we have all the fresco samples even on this pillar here. All the pillars were frescoed, plastered and frescoed. And then we have really the most beautiful first century synagogue of all those discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And besides that, it's the first synagogue where Jesus would have preached.
I was going to say, there's almost no doubt that Jesus preached here.
Pat, you'd have to be an academic acrobat to bring about arguments to prove that Jesus was not in this synagogue.
Right.
He would walk 2 days from Nazareth on his way to Bethsaida, another day's walking in Capernaum. And this was the point of contact.
He had to
with the
pass
lake.
this area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's one very, very strong reason in order to get there. Secondly, there's a port here, and to go from here by boat across is much more attractive than hiking all around the lake.
Right.
Especially if his mama was with him or some older people were with him.
And there was always talk of him crossing to the other side.
Absolutely.
So what are the chances that this synagogue existed when Jesus was
Well,
here
it did.
historically?
From the coin there that we just saw from the year 29, this coin was found inside the year 29.
Oh, wow.
It was found inside. But we have about 2,000 coins here in the discovery.
Wow.
The pottery is absolutely first century pottery. There's also another argument that Jesus was here. I think that's very powerful, is that this is a fish processing town. And we know that Jesus wasn't with truck drivers. He was with fishermen.
Yeah.
And we have a fish processing town, both its Greek and its Hebrew and Aramaic names derived from the fish processing industry, just like Detroit is called Motown.
Right.
This was called Fish Tower, and it was called Tossing Town, related to the tossing of the fish for export, salting them for
Right.
export to Rome through
Right.
the port of Caesarea Maritima.
Right.
So sociologically and geographically, we're in a place that's absolutely fits the picture. And Jesus meshed and integrated with the fisher community. So, and this is their key town for export. So here we're sitting in an extraordinary treasure for the Jewish people. A first century, the most beautiful first century synagogue. The first synagogue ever excavated where Jesus would have preached, and also after Pentecost where disciples would have gathered on Shabbat with the Jewish community, also being Jews themselves.
Right.
So here we have a crossroads of Jewish and Christian history. Here we can look each other in the eye and say, we have been broken apart since, but we belong here. Here are our roots. Here we have so much we share in common. And this is a great call that we need for our time.
Isn't it amazing, standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, looking at excavation sites, seeing a synagogue where for sure Jesus had stood in his lifetime, seeing the Magdala stone and understanding the significance of the Magdala stone. I mean, this is amazing, enriching experience. So when we bring this to you, we have such a full heart to be able to share it, to have you see it, and to have you share it with others. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you really have a smile on your face after seeing that. Next up, we have part 2 of my 3-part interview with Greg Kokel. Why do we have 3 parts with Greg Kokel? Because there is so much great content in our conversation. We didn't want to cut any of it out. You already saw part 1. Now let's dive into part 2.
We want acceptance. We want to belong. All of these things are part of what God offers through Jesus. It fits.
Wow, that was extraordinarily powerful, especially given the audience that you were in where you're communicating this. Did you have a sense of the audience, or could you feel them, or was there any response to it maybe after
You
you were
know,
done?
this is, Patrick, I was really surprised about the audience because I expected massive hostility. and
Can I
maybe
just
if
interrupt for a second? You expected massive hostility, but you went anyway. So tell me about what runs through your mind when you're walking into something and saying, I expect this to be a hostile environment.
Well, I'm nervous,
Yeah.
but I'm well prepared. In other words, I know what I want to say, and so I usually I get my material out, and then the stage is set for an interactive Q&A.
Right.
And that's when it can get a little bit more difficult. And maybe if I went back today, it would be different for me. But what happened with that group? And it's hard to tell why it was, but that group was just paying attention. You know, I don't want to say riveted, but they were really paying attention. And when I got to this point where I said the answer to guilt is forgiveness, then I added, and this is where Jesus comes in. And I had not mentioned Jesus' name the entire time. I hadn't talked about God. I was talking about relativism.
Right.
And I was giving, in a certain sense, a philosophic talk on the failure of moral relativism and therefore the success of some form of absolute morality, if you will, or objective morality. But I explained this has explanatory power, and it's the best explanation for the way things are, kind of thing. And that's when I was able to go hear it. But now I was able to just leverage this philosophic discussion into Jesus, which I think it's an indication that Jesus deals with reality. I can talk about this stuff and see, look at the connection. This is real. And the next night, I talked about Jesus being the only way of salvation. That was the topic. Right. So I told him, if you want to hear about that, you're going to have to come back the next night. And it was a full house again on Saturday night here on campus for that second event. But yeah, it was a good response, and those are the circumstances too where I just have to trust the power of God to use His own word, essentially. Now, I wasn't quoting the Bible, but I was communicating the gospel. I was giving, in a certain sense, the word of God. I was explaining the truth that the Bible describes about God rescuing through Jesus, through forgiveness, because of the trade. And this has power. The gospel is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. And so whether I think you're quoting the verses or you're summing it up, right, you're still doing the job there. And I could see the impact it was having on the audience. Now, my goal in these kinds of things isn't to have an altar call, isn't to pray to receive Christ. Now when I got a secular audience, I always start by telling them, I'm a follower of Jesus, but I'm not here to convert you, okay? I just want to annoy you in a good way, right? I want to just put a stone in your shoe. And they start laughing like you're doing because they expect the Christian to annoy them. And I say, okay, I'm your guy, but you'll thank me when I'm done, kind of thing. If I can just get you thinking about something. And that night, I think I put a big giant stone in people's shoes to have them thinking about Jesus and about their own life, and why there is a certain reasonableness to our claims. And that was the whole rationale of an hour talking about the failure of a very popular way of thinking right now, moral relativism. That's not going to work because relativism is false. Everybody does. That's why they complain about the problem of evil.
Right.
Because if they were deeply committed to relativism, they wouldn't complain about evil. That makes no sense in a relativistic world. No, there's got to be real good, real morality in order for there to be real evil. And everybody knows there's real evil. See, now this gives me a leg up, Patrick, as a Christian. I know something true about the person I'm talking to. He believes in the problem of evil.
Right.
Great. That's because there is a problem. But you know what? That testifies to my view. That's in favor of my view. It's not against my view. And I can use that to help him see the rest of the story, so to speak. And I think that's the kind of thing that was happening that night.
Wow. Quite an experience, and thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So you spoke to the problem of evil. What are some of the other major challenges to Christianity that you have taken on over time that you think are the key ones that you have worked through or that you've helped others work through?
Yeah, the problem of evil certainly is huge, and I think that I happily respond to the problem because, as I've kind of described, this gives me a foothold in discussion because we're dealing with something we both agree with, evil in the world, and this has ramifications for theism in a good sense, not a bad sense. I think ultimately that there is evil in the world is evidence for God, not against Him, and I've described some of that dynamic. And I think it also positions me well with regards to Jesus being a singular solution to the problem, because singular problems often require singular solutions, okay? And this brings up the issue of religious pluralism. There are a lot of different religious options that are available to people, and generally people want to relativize those options. They want to say, okay, all the religions are equally legitimate sources to God. Now, I wonder sometimes when I hear people say that if they've actually thought about that. Because, for example, Christianity and Islam and Judaism teach that God is a personal being. all right? Hinduism, or at least some forms of it, teach that God is not personal, that he's a kind of an all-pervading force. Let's describe it that way. Well, look, God cannot be personal and not personal at the same time. If the Jews and Hindus and Christians are right, the Jews and Muslims and Christians are right on that point, then the Hindus are wrong. If the Hindus are right, then the Christians and Jews and Muslims are wrong, but they can't both be right.
Right.
And now we're not talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, are we? We're talking about a central thing, the nature of God himself. When you die, maybe you go to heaven or hell, maybe you get reincarnated, maybe you lie in the grave, but you can't do them all at the same time, right?
Right.
So the argument that I have against religious pluralism, against the idea that all religions are equally true, is that they have contradictory claims about reality, therefore they can't true. They can all be false, but they can't be true, all true in any meaningful sense. Okay? And this isn't bigotry, which
Right.
is the standard response from people. Oh, that's bigotry. It's not bigotry, it's math. Okay? Now, it could be my view is wrong. I'm certainly open to that possibility, and this is why I look carefully at the evidence and the reasons, okay? But they can't all be true, and to say it is a kind of a condescending patronizing, because you don't really believe that all these religious claims are true at the same time. It's just a way of saying, basically, there is no real truth about religion. All it is a bunch of clubs and people do what they like. Well, that's a way of saying that all people are actually wrong in their religious views, you know. So my take on this is that pluralism defeats itself as a point of view. So therefore, somebody shouldn't be faulted when he's trying to figure out which take on religion is actually accurate,
Right.
and comes to a conclusion that he thinks is right. Why is that considered arrogant? But this is the way people actually deal with it a lot. It's dismissive. As a Christian, I say there's a reason why Jesus is the only way. He solves the problem.
Right.
And he's the only one who did. Every one of the other religious leaders had the problem. Therefore, they couldn't solve it. Jesus didn't have the problem. He wasn't a sinner. He wasn't under judgment, but he could take the judgment, okay? Now, there's a lot more detail to all of that stuff, but the point here is the problem is religious pluralism, problem of evil. The problem of religious pluralism, Jesus being the only way, that's another objectionable element. And I just want people to see, well, there's nothing odd about thinking you're right about a religious point of view. Everybody thinks they're right about their religious point of view that they hold, or else they wouldn't hold it, you know? Why is it the Christian generally is the only one that's faulted for thinking is right? And it's crazy. In any event, so that addresses two of the main issues. Okay.
Can I ask if there's a derivative one that comes from this, as you're bringing up, people maybe from the East or from other parts of the world. So the derivative issue is, what of the person, the human being, that's never exposed to Christianity?
Yeah.
So, because that's also, a problem in the sense of, okay, well, nobody ever spoke to them about
Right.
Christianity.
Right.
What is your view on that?
Yeah, that's a common question that's brought up, and just a little side observation. That's a problem for every religious view.
Of course.
If every religion claims their religion is correct, then what about the people who are never exposed to their religion? Now, I think Hinduism in some forms can get around that, because what they could say is, well, here's the way reality is structured, so to speak, that we're all kind of part of an illusion, and we all are part of God, and we just have to kind of get back to God. And whatever religious enterprise that you're pursuing will probably get you back there sooner or later. So Hinduism seems to people to be a little bit more expansive than others. It has its own difficulties in its overall claims of reality, like that we're just part of an illusion. And I don't know how I could know that. I mean, does Charlie Brown know he's a cartoon character? You know, it seems to me there's a built-in difficulty there. But in any event, the fact is that this problem you're raising applies to other religions. How do Christians respond to it? And as a general response, I'll say that God judges people according to the revelation that they have, okay? They can't be held responsible for information that was never given them,
Right.
okay? Now, before I just leave it at that, I want to say, but there's a catch to this one, and that is that the story makes it clear. And here, when I say the story, I'm talking about the story of reality that the Bible gives us. The story makes it clear that every single person who is reasonably developed intellectually, and I don't mean smart people, I mean that you're not a baby,
Right.
or you're not mentally handicapped, Every single person is in possession of information about the truth about God, such that they can be held responsible for that. And that information is twofold. It's information inside of them, and it's information out there in the world that they can see. Okay? And those two things, that maybe they don't know about Jesus, but as one put it, they don't know about the Son, but they do know about the Father, whose presence is everywhere. So on the one hand, God will judge them according to the light that they've been given, but everyone has been given enough light to be considered guilty before God.
Well, and that goes right to the heart of ethics, doesn't it? Because in the absence of choice, there is no ethics.
Yeah, that's right. There's no ethical choices, that's for sure.
Yeah. A shark's not unethical for attacking a human.
No,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
but that's because ethics don't even apply to
Exactly,
sharks
because they
or
have no
lions
choice.
or anything.
Right.
This is
humans.
another point that humans are special in this regard. Clearly, they apply to us, but they apply to nothing else in the created realm.
Right.
I know there's some Darwinists who want to argue differently. It's a kind of a different issue, but certainly objective morality
That's right.
is not something that other creatures are aware of. And even the Darwinists, all they can produce in Darwinism is just another form of subjective morality. But that's another issue. So we've got Jesus being the only way, and the problem of evil as the religious pluralism. These are big deals. Another big thing is Jesus himself. I mean, Jesus is under fire. Since Jesus is the center of Christianity, he's a sine qua non, he's a that without which you don't have it. You take Jesus out, no more Christianity. What happens if Jesus never existed? Okay, well, okay, we're pretty much dead in the water. What if he existed, but he wasn't anything like the person you claim? Maybe there was some guy who's an itinerant preacher, but this miracle-working Jesus, born of a virgin, 12 disciples, all this other stuff, this is just a rehashing of the ancient, dying, rising Messiah myths of the Egyptians and the Roman mystery cults and stuff like this. So a very popular claim here. And a lot of people are making it today. You can find it easily on the internet. Let me just say this, that with regards to the idea that Jesus never existed and that he is just a fabrication of these ancient myths, there is no credentialed historian in the world that believes this. Now, when I say none, I mean, you might find an outlier, but you can always find somebody to say something that's odd. They don't believe this. And the reason they don't believe this is they are working with bona fide primary source historical documents about the life of Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
And they're solid and they're good, and you can draw lots of information. And in addition to those documents, which we commonly know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and some of the things that Saul of Tarsus wrote, and some of the others, James, who knew Jesus, and New Testament documents, which people need to remember are not just part of the Bible. They think of it that way. These were separate documents that were circulating in the first century. It wasn't until the 4th and 5th centuries that they bound them together in a book called a codex, okay? So you can't just say, well, that's the Bible. These are the sources that historians use, and they take them seriously because they're good sources. But there's also something like 17 or 18 extra biblical references to Jesus that give us substantive information that corroborate what we find in the more detailed narratives of Jesus' life. Okay, so when you look at this particular challenge, this is an example of a tactic I call just the facts, ma'am. All right, okay, I get what you're saying. Do the facts support that claim? And the answer is no. And in fact, the similarities that are claimed between Jesus and these ancient myths of Osiris and Mithras, etc., 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 there is almost no similarity between the life of Jesus and these ancient mythology. These have been trumped up radically on the internet, and what happens, these stories keep going in a circle. I remember I was lecturing at Purdue, and there was another big giant audience there, a bit more hostile that night than that wonderful crowd at Berkeley. But there was a whole group of atheists that showed up with their T-shirts on, and then during the Q&A, I had 2 questions on the same issue. And I wasn't actually trying to be glib at all, but when the first person asked the question about Jesus being just a rehashing of these old mythologies, I said, you've been spending too much time on the internet. What happened is everybody started laughing, and I didn't at all mean to embarrass him, but this is what happens. Somebody publishes this kind of crazy story, and it really goes back to late 19th century with a book called The Golden Bough, and B-O-U-G-H, and then that got some traction, and now these stories are circulating all the time. But when you go back to the primary source documents, the old sources that tell the original myths, you don't see the kinds of similarities that people are claiming. So this is a vacuous kind of charge. When you talk to real historians, you get some entirely different story. So we are on really good solid ground when it comes to the historical evidence for Jesus of Nazareth. And frankly, that's the only evidence we need. We don't need a perfect Bible to make our case. What about all the contradictions? Those don't matter to making our case. Now, I want to be careful when I say this because Christians might misunderstand. I do believe in an inerrant Bible, okay? But I don't. When you think about the gospel going out in the first century, you didn't have the apostles and all the evangelists and everybody sharing their faith carrying around codices of Scripture that they were trying to convince people were the inspired, inerrant Word of God in order that they can get saved. They were telling people about Jesus, who lived, who died on a Roman cross, and who walked out of that grave 3 days later, and who was seen by many witnesses, which witnesses had their lives completely transformed as a result, went to their death in many cases with this testimony on their lips, I saw Jesus. And also skeptics and like James, and also outright hostile enemies like Saul of Tarsus. They were changed because they encountered the risen Christ. This becomes powerful evidence.
Yeah, and when you look at the history, to match that evidence, because some of the detractors would say, well, because you were using the term of first century, that the Gospels, as far as dating them.
Yeah.
Some people think they came much later.
Yeah.
So, when you really look at the balance of what the scholars have found in the data and research relative to dating the Gospels,
Right.
What is the conclusion that you've drawn based on what you've seen?
Yeah, this is a good question because times have changed, and in the last 50 years, there's been a significant shift in the opinions of scholars. And the tendency in the past was to late date the Gospels, put them, early first century to late second century, and I mean way after these events took place, long after the witnesses could have testified to anybody copying the information. And this, of course, impugns the credibility of the accounts themselves, if this is the case. But I have asked scholar after scholar, why do you late date the Gospels? What are the reasons for it? Now, I'm prepared to give a number of arguments for an early date. These are strong arguments. One of them, for example, is that one of the most important events in the first century regarding spiritual things and Christians and Jews and everything was the destruction of the temple and all of Jerusalem in 70 AD by Titus of Rome. This is huge. None of the writers mention it. How could nobody mention the destruction of Jerusalem? Especially if they're trying to make a case for Christianity, and this would be a great dig back at the Jews. See what happened? God destroyed Jerusalem because you rejected the Messiah that we just invented, right? In the late Gospels. Nobody mentions it. Here's a good reason they didn't mention it. It hadn't happened yet. Okay, this is one line of argumentation for earlier dates for the Gospels, but there's a whole bunch of others that are very good. But every time I ask about why you late date, I get the same answer, because you have what theologians call a high Christology in the Gospels. And a high Christology means Jesus wasn't just an itinerant preacher who said some nice things and happened to get himself killed. Who knows why anybody would kill a guy like that, but that's all he was. Later on, everybody started developing him into the supernatural Son of God, only way of salvation, miracle worker, risen from the dead. That's mythology. And mythology takes time to develop. And so we must have, Gospels must have been written much later because it takes time for that kind of mythology to develop. Now you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, that sounds like cheating a little bit. You're kind of assuming that Jesus wasn't this person. For what reason? You're assuming that there was no miracles. You're assuming there is no Son of God. You're assuming that, and the fact that it shows up that way in the accounts must be proof that they were mythological things developing over time.
So it's a confirmation bias.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. Now one trouble with that way of looking at it is not only the circular reasoning, but Paul's writings, there's not a lot of contention about the basic writings of Paul. He was a huge player in the first century, and everybody knew it. And certain things like Galatians and Romans and Corinthians, and these are major contributions of Paul to the literature of that day, and it's not contested as being written by Paul. All right? And we know these things are like in the 50s. Right? Paul was executed around 63. That's the end of his life. So he's writing in the 50s. Right. Okay, Jesus died in 33. So within 20 years, we have Paul writing in Romans saying that he was declared with power to be the Son of God according to the resurrection. That's the third verse of the book of Romans. He launches the book of Romans with this statement. That is high Christology in the 50s. Wow, so we have good reason to believe this didn't develop through mythology. This was the earliest testimony that the people who are defending Christianity gave about Jesus of Nazareth. So all that to say, we have good reason to believe the historical reliability of these texts. There's a lot of detail in them. There's a lot of things that are embarrassing to the people who are recording these and writing them down. I mean, the disciples, they didn't look good. They looked pretty stupid. Pretty dumb, unethical at many points. Let's call down fire from heaven on them and destroy them. This is James and John, the beloved disciple, sons of thunder. Jesus said, no. Women are the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Why is that significant? Because they didn't have women's lib back then.
Right.
They didn't trust women. So if you're gonna write a story that you want people to believe, but it's false, make women the first testifiers to the risen Christ. That's dumb. Okay.
So it's interesting because I guess there's two things here. One is say archaeological evidence that would corroborate, but
that's another stage of corroboration.
And I want to ask you about that in a
testimony,
second. But the second is the fact that if somebody has an agenda that to get an outcome that is separate from what's true.
Yes.
That's not the way to get it.
That's not the way to get it, right?
Yeah. So they weren't being cunning; they were being reporters.
Well, see, this is the conclusion when you look at the details, because you'd think if the writers were being cunning, there are certain things that show up in the account that you wouldn't show up there.
Right.
Okay, and there are lots of other things that also show up that are odd. For example, Jesus is struck in one of the accounts, and the soldiers strike Jesus, and then they say, "Who struck you?" And if you're a reader of that account, you're thinking, "You struck me. I just saw you hit me." Why is that in there? Well, you don't know until you read one of the parallel accounts where it identifies that Jesus was blindfolded by these soldiers. Now, these are two separate accounts. And the second account makes sense of something that seems unusual in the first account.
Right.
These are odd ways that you see these accounts kind of supporting each other, and then you see, well, this wasn't fabricated. Okay, this is an argument against the fabrication thesis, and there's lots of things like that too. So they weren't cunning, and this gives you reason to believe the accounts. Now, one objection that could be raised is, oh, well, you're saying that these scholars have a bias, and that's why they put it. Well, the Christians had a bias too. They believed in Jesus, and so they were trying to put forth an account that made Jesus look good and Christianity look good, so they had a bias. Now, and to this I say that there are, I understand the point you're making, and I guess the Christians did have a bias if what you mean is a point of view. But there's two types of biases. There's a bias that is a bias to distort.
Right.
And then there is a bias in which you have a point of view in which there's no evidence of distortion. Okay? I imagine that Kobe Bryant's mom thinks he's a pretty good basketball player.
Right.
And you could say, well, she's biased, but she also happens to be right.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
She has a point of view, but that doesn't mean she's false in her assessment.
Right.
Okay? Now, in the case of the scholars now, we can see it's pretty obvious that they are late dating because they are committed to a point of view regarding Jesus before they view the evidence. Okay? That sounds suspiciously like a bias to distort. Okay? What about the early Christians? What about the people who gave the message first, I saw Jesus, and they proclaimed this kind of message? Did they have a bias to distort? Were they lying?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the rule about lying is this. If you want to tell a lie, you tell a lie that benefits you, not a lie that gets you beaten, stoned, whipped,
Right.
and crucified upside down.
Right.
All right?
Yeah.
This is not smart.
Right.
All right. So this is what happened to these guys. If anybody knew that the story was false, it was these apostles who testified to having seen the risen Christ. But these guys, in many cases, went to their death with this testimony on their lips, and certainly all the rest of them had the sentence of death hanging over them for making such a testimony. And Saul of Tarsus is an example of the executioner. He was the one who was going around collecting these guys and putting them to death, hauling women and men off to prison and overseeing their executions. So this was serious business for these guys. Where is the evidence of bias to distort in the case of the disciples who wrote the Gospels? There's no evidence. And if there's no evidence, then we have no reason to impugn their character on this account. I once saw a video on YouTube, and it was talking about that there is no evidence of purpose in the universe. You look around the universe and look at all this empty space, there's no evidence of purpose. Now, apart from particular instances of teleology you might point to, like, well, what about this thing that's designed this certain way? And there's great arguments there. But it strikes me that just the ability to look around to see if there's evidence of purpose is itself an example of teleology and purpose.
Yes.
Who does that?
Yes.
Only people who have this capability to see purpose are people who are made to see purpose. There's a purpose built into that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I
So,
do. Well, I mean, the person who's making the assertion is, has a purpose in doing so.
Yes, that's right. And in this particular case, though, he's looking for purpose in the universe. So it's not just like localized purpose. It seems to me that unless there is purpose, you wouldn't have the machinery to be able to look for it.
That's
you know, like you said, dogs don't do that. But anyway,
That's right.
So
Right. Well, that's what distinguishes a human being from every other form of animal on the planet. We can choose a purpose.
Yes, that's
and,
right.
And when you choose that purpose and you align with it, suddenly now you have energy.
You have and you have meaning.
Yes.
Now it may just be small m meaning because you can do that kind of thing without God.
Right.
But the big M meaning you can't get without God. That's another element.
Now I want to ask you a personal question that's experiential in nature.
Okay.
You've got, your career has spanned many decades now, and you've really put a lot of effort into organizing your thinking and your intellectual life and creating this view that you're sharing with us here. Along the way, during this period, when you look at the Bible, and you look at the New Testament, and there have been archaeological discoveries that corroborate what was there. So basically, there is the acceptance of this already, and then there's physical corroborative evidence, this many years later.
Sure.
My question is, and it's on the personal level. I mean, we can have the intellectual conversation, saying,
Right.
"Wow, and this increased validation, increased conviction,
Right.
all these great things that does." But I'm wondering what that feels like for you when these things would unfold with you committed your life to this.
Yeah.
And then these things emerge.
Yeah.
What did that feel like?
Well, I imagine it's something like when you get married and you are obviously convinced of your choice, which is why you walk down the aisle and say, I do, and your spouse has all of these virtues that you are now beginning to enjoy. But once you get married, that there are going to be a lot of surprises, things that just simply don't present themselves in single life or dating life. But when you're living together over time, you see these little things blossoming, and they're added bonus, if you will. and you think to yourself, wow, that's nice. I didn't know this came with the package too. Wow, that's great, you know. And I think something like that is going on for me when I see these other things happening. There's a massive body of evidence, multiple lines of reasoning that I think bring justification, validation to my confidence and my convictions. But when you start to see these little surprising things pop up, then you think, wow, that's great. In the area of archaeology, for example, there's been a lot of work that's been done just on the Exodus. And one of the difficulties with the Old Testament in particular and history and archaeology is that there didn't seem to be much evidence for this massive event called the Exodus. And if it really took place, boy, you would think there would be some footsteps in history like that, you know, in the sand, so to speak, that they uncover. Well, it turns out, and I can't give you a lot of particulars because I can't remember, but they've been looking in the wrong time period. Right. If you shift things over to another time period, there's a reason why they did that. They made a mistake, and it seems possibly that they did. You shift to a different time period, all of a sudden, all these things come together, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence. And when I saw that, I thought, that's pretty cool. That was like bonus material, right? Right. Added benefit or at no extra charge kind of thing. And not only that, when I'm privy to personal things that happen in people's lives, dramatic answers to prayers, dramatic manifestations of God's power in somebody's life. Now, these aren't the kind of things that happen in my life a lot. I mean, I'm not having miracles happen all the time. I'm not having miracles happening at all, for the most part, you know, if you think of the standard definition of a miracle. But at the same time, when I do see these things happen in other people's lives, that is an encouragement to my own conviction. So it's great when things like that happen. It's just like I said, bonus material. So that comes with the package.
So with that, how do you see conviction? Do you see it as a matter of degree, or you have it or you don't?
Well, in my view, the way you put the question, I'd say it's a both and. This has to do with the nature of faith, okay? If you're going to take an airplane ride to go somewhere, okay, you are making your decision to climb on an airplane based on information that you have. And it may be good information. So this is a good airline. I know here's the travel plan, and they have good employees. The guy can fly the plane, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, so you have a kind of faith or belief that comes before actually getting on the airplane. But when you get on the airplane, you do something different, right? Now you're all in, so to speak, all right? Now, what if you weren't quite so sure about that airplane? You know, what if you were a little nervous about it? You know, you might not put your full weight down on the plane when you got in, kind of thing, but even though you're not as confident, you're still all in when you climb on the airplane. Right. Okay, and so there is a certain sense in which convictions are all in that you're investing your life in it. But then there's another sense where one gets more comfortable that they're in good hands, fly in the friendly skies, that kind of thing. Right. We're going to get to our destination. Now, this is important because I think actually an airplane ride is a good metaphor, because when you get in the airplane, it doesn't always go smoothly. You can hit turbulence, we can have problems, whatever, you know. And so that's when you're wondering, do I have a competent pilot? Did they tighten all the bolts down, you know? Did they fasten the rivets properly? Did they get enough fuel? You know, who's running this thing after? So that's when your confidence in the whole package helps you through the rough times. Right. And certainly there are rough times in life for everybody. It's the human condition. And so there are going to be rough times for Christians. And so I think it's both that are true. In my own life, I'm all in. Right. But there are other things that can happen that increase my confidence and conviction, and consequently my sense of rest and repose, even in the midst of turbulence.
That completes part 2 of my 3-part interview with Greg Kokel. There is still more to come, and it keeps getting better. I look forward to seeing you in part 3. Well, that's it for episode 6. We are really getting down toward the final stretch here for our 9-part docuseries, Christ Revealed, the history, the evidence, and the inspiration. I want to encourage you to own Christ Revealed. Again, we have multiple packages, varying bonuses, things that I think will serve you for years to come, and things that I think you'll want to share with people that you care about most. So thanks for tuning in here. Look forward to seeing you in episode 7.